Welcome to CivilNet. The OSCE Minsk Group is a group set up in 1992 to encourage a peaceful negotiated settlement of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and consists of three co-chair countries, France, the United States and Russia. We're joined today by a former US co-chair of the OSCE Minsk Group, Ambassador Cavanaugh. We'll be discussing what's next for Nagorno-Karabakh and how the OSCE Minsk Group fits into all of this. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time.
It's my pleasure to be with you today.
So to start off, following the November 9th ceasefire agreement, the Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev stated that the problem of Karabakh is already in the past. What is your assessment of the situation?
I must say I disagree with that. Let me add, today we are rapidly approaching 100 days since the November 9th ceasefire. So I think we're at a milestone point as to where things stand and where they need to go. And I understand why President Aliyev would say he felt this issue was a thing of the past. Indeed, it's a problem of the past. It's a problem of the past over 1,000 years of patterns of ethnic groups across the Caucasus and how they've been scattered. But it's clearly a problem of the past decades where there had been a very active conflict over this region, as we know, broke out before the collapse of the Soviet Union, ceasefire established in '94, and sporadic fighting with small arms fired, artillery fire along the line of contact for decades, and for decades efforts to bring about a peaceful resolution of this conflict. What did not happen in the 44-day war that took place last year was certainly peaceful resolution of this conflict. And President Aliyev had said this repeatedly, that there was a way to solve this conflict. It just wasn't through peace. It was through use of force. That others had said that wasn't possible. He had proven it was possible. He did not, because it's not resolved. It's, again, once more a ceasefire. But the underlying issues, how the people live together, under what framework, how you set a path, a true path toward the future of peace is still over the horizon. And I think we see that or saw that in the ceasefire agreement that President Putin helped broker on November 9th, that it has clear references to continuation of the Minsk Group process and working toward a peaceful resolution of the conflict.
And as you mentioned, this is a ceasefire agreement, not a final peace accord. Yet it has certain stipulations that have mixed up the sequence of a peaceful settlement that was under consideration for the past 2 decades. Do you see any possibility of going back to that logic, for example, regarding the return of refugees, when there is no final agreement and no technical feasibility to ensure that? Or, for example, communications being unblocked. Given the current level of unresolved issues like the Armenian POWs issue, do you think this is a possibility to go back to that logic?
Go back to the logic of discussing a peaceful resolution? No, I think it is. I think, one, as a former peace mediator, I believe it's always possible to go back and continue to work on peace. That I highlighted the 100th anniversary was actually very specifically over this situation as regards POWs and missing. We see numbers now ranging from 60 to over 200 Armenian POWs are missing in action. 100 days after a ceasefire has been established, almost as many days after the introduction of almost 2,000 Russian peacekeepers. There's no excuse for that. And I think that today is the leading issue that needs to be addressed first, actually, is get that issue, which was agreed to as part of the ceasefire, into the past. while this peaceful resolution will take a while, this should not take that long. International Committee for the Red Cross was committed to helping with this. They're remarkably good at this. And the reason that it hasn't been resolved is not them at this point. There needs to be greater goodwill to put this issue to bed, to move forward with other issues, and there are many.
And since the ceasefire agreement brokered by the Kremlin, many see the OSCE Minsk group as having been sidelined and that Russia has taken the driver's seat. Although Moscow itself stresses the need to consider the basic principles for the conflict resolution that have been worked out in previous years. However, it is obvious that Russia may not want to share its leading role with the other co-chairmen countries. How do you see the Minsk group's new role, if it still can play any role?
I certainly think it can play a role. It's an adjusted role, but I think in some ways less adjusted too than many people think. Russia in the driver's seat is an image that certainly fits today, but it actually has always fit when it comes to brokering ceasefires. It was Russia that brokered the 1994 ceasefire, Russia that brokered the 2016 ceasefire, Russia that brokered the ceasefire in the summer before the last round of fighting, in Russia that has now brokered the last one. It was always understood at OSCE and within the Minsk group process that when it came to ceasefires, Russia would take a lead. If for no other reason, Russia is physically there. Russia borders Azerbaijan. Russia had military forces in Armenia. Russia had the ability to deploy more quickly than any other Minsk group party could. And at the same time, Russia has always felt, ever since 1994, indeed, you could say 1994 became a watershed event in this, that Russia can't solve this problem alone. Russia joined the OSCE effort in the early days of the conflict. In the earliest days of the conflict under Gorbachev, Russia couldn't solve it by itself. Once the collapse of the Soviet Union had taken place, Russia sought to solve it by itself. Realized it could not. This is back to the days of Kazimierov, and I worked with Kazimierov too in an earlier instance before I was a Minsk group co-chair. Russia realized, no, this had to be a joint effort. And I think that commitment to the Minsk group remains. And we saw that right up to the ceasefire. Indeed, the ceasefire was brokered in Moscow, but there was also actually first an effort by Putin to get a ceasefire. That did not work. Then an effort by Emmanuel Macron of France to get a ceasefire. That did not work. Then foreign ministers were in Washington in an effort to get a ceasefire. That didn't work. Followed by a meeting of the co-chairs with foreign ministers in Geneva for a ceasefire. That didn't work. Then Russia was successful on that, as has been the case throughout the past. But that just reinforced again and again the desire to do this as a group. And I think even the November 9th agreement reflects that. I've said on the record before, everything in that agreement were elements that had been discussed before as part of the co-chair's efforts to bring around peaceful resolution of this conflict. The only thing that was new on November 9th was Russian peacekeepers. Indeed, up to that point, we had a general view that peacekeepers would come from neither the co-chair countries nor neighboring countries. So no Russians, no French, no Americans, but also no Turks, no Iranians, and no Georgians. And that was an easy shorthand that had grown out of the Key West discussions and had continued to be on the table.
And we have now entered the Biden era. Do you think we are now likely to see greater US engagement in the region? And what would this mean, in your opinion, for the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, the OSCE Minsk group, and Russia's role also in the region?
No, I do think we will. You saw the first telephone call President Biden made was with Vladimir Putin. In contrast to President Trump, the gist of that call was issued publicly immediately by both sides. The Nagorno-Karabakh was also raised in that discussion. You may have seen more recently a discussion between Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, and his Turkish counterparts. And there too, Nagorno-Karabakh was raised. So no, I think you will get greater attention to that. I think the sense of what to do with Nagorno-Karabakh, that's not fully fleshed out yet. These conversations between presidents or national security advisor is only the beginning, highlighting the need to work on this. President Biden has just started appointing his government officials. He's still doing cabinet members. I think there'll be some key appointments to come that will have bearing on this. One that I'm somewhat anxious to see is who will be appointed to be ambassador to OSCE. We saw last year, in part due to an effort by Azerbaijan, there was a stagnation at OSCE as leadership positions could not be filled. Those have now been filled. There's a new chairman in office, Ann Linde of Sweden. I've seen already she plans to be quite strident in working on conflict resolution in this region. And my hope is that President Biden will appoint an American ambassador to OSCE who has both experience with the greater region and experience with multilateral institutions like OSCE to also take a very strong stance there. So no, my anticipation is more engagement, more activity.
I'm also interested what you think about Turkey at the moment. Many observers now speculate, and Armenia's foreign minister, Ara Ayvazyan, stated that Turkey does not really have a reason any longer to blockade Armenia. How do you see the prospect of normalization of relations between Armenia and Turkey?
I think it's very important. It's an issue I had worked on in the past as well. I think if you do a reading of the November 9th ceasefire agreement, it certainly envisions that. In fact, many of the Minsk group proposals that had been discussed with the leaders of both Armenia and Azerbaijan always had inside of them the reopening of the border and the reestablishment of significant economic contacts. I was a little disheartened. November 9th agreement talks about the establishment of corridors, but it doesn't talk about a broader opening of the border. And I know from when we had looked at this in the past, a corridor's important and can serve a very valuable function, but that wasn't the only place that it made economic sense to be opening the border. In fact, there were others where business and trade relations between Eastern Anatolia and Armenia would be far greater if different regions were opened and different road and rail links were established. I think the scheme for the region needs to be one that's broader in scope and more strategic, and not simply the establishment of, yes, corridor through Lachin, corridor to Nakhchivan, but a much greater array of how trade will take place between Turkey and Armenia, and between Armenia and Azerbaijan as well.
And finally, I want to ask, many are worried that there may be future hostilities again, but others are talking about preparing populations of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Nagorno-Karabakh for peace. In your opinion, what needs to be done for a lasting, negotiated, final settlement of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict?
Well, I mean, I think one, we need to get past this issue on POWs. We have to get that resolved quickly because I think that undermines popular support for peace efforts. It raised questions about whether you can trust the other side to engage properly and do the right thing. The other piece I see missing today, and it ties not so much to peace discussions at the table, but to both rebuilding and reestablishing what was destroyed in the war, is humanitarian access to Nagorno-Karabakh. This has become a major issue. It was raised at the beginning of the year. Aliyev complained when French parliamentarians went to Karabakh. Just this past week, we saw coming out of Stepanakert announcements that foreigners would have to get special permission to go to Karabakh. That had been the case before anyway. Russian peacekeepers are being careful who can travel. I understand that there's security concerns there, but I also know the restrictions on travel, on humanitarian access, are impeding efforts by international institutions like the United Nations, UNESCO, to come and look at historic sites that need to be protected and heritage sites like Daravank. And I think that becomes an issue, but also agencies that would help with rebuilding on both sides of the former line of contact. They need freer access to travel to this region. I think, as you mentioned, there are groups that want to facilitate how you build greater public support for peace on both sides. To do that, they need to be able to get to this region. And it is fettered now in a way with travel restrictions, call for visas, blacklists that are not helpful. If we want to see rebuilding of villages, demining of territory, reestablishment of trade connections, many groups from the outside need to have freer access to go into the region and do the job that, in part, only the international community can easily do. Russia is providing humanitarian assistance. It's peacekeeping force is helping deliver that, but what's needed in the region, again, on all sides, is far more support than that. And the best way to do that is to create a regimen of fairly open humanitarian access that allows this to take place.
Well, Ambassador, thank you very much for your time again.
You're very, very welcome. Pleasure talking with you today.
The pleasure is ours, and thank you for joining us on CivilNet.